Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
Hello, this is John Bicknell. Before we get into today's discussion, we have a very special announcement. In a couple of weeks, we will be having a live podcast recording. During this live podcast recording, we're going to have some special guests who will field your questions. In order to join this special podcast recording, however, you need to be an IPA member. So there is no better time than now to join IPA and support our mission. So head on over to information-professionals.org, and there is a link in the show notes as well to sign up for membership if you're not a member already. Also, follow IPA on both LinkedIn and Twitter for more information about this special live podcast recording and how you can participate. And now on to today's discussion. My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Dr. Brendan Mulvaney, who is the director of the China Aerospace Studies Institute, and you will hear us refer to this as CASI, which is part of the Air University. Prior to this position, Dr. Mulvaney was a U.S. Marine Corps Cobra pilot and a Chinese language and cultural expert. Brendan Mulvaney, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Great. Thanks for having me here today. Looking forward to the conversation.
Likewise. Just a quick little preamble here. Brendan, you may not realize this, but coincidentally, I have had an overrepresentation of Marines on the podcast. And to our podcast audience, I would love to have additional people from the other U.S. military services and other representation from our national security community. The coincidence that we've just happened to have had a number of Marines on the podcast does not reflect the need to have a more diverse set of voices to talk about information and cognitive related challenges. So, but Brendan, love having you on. I'm also a retired Marine, and so we can talk about a couple of things that might map back to some of our Marine Corps days as well. But the conversation that I'd like to have with you today, Brendan, will cover various geopolitical, cultural, military, and talent matters related to China. And our audience will be especially interested to learn a bit about some Chinese political and military thought leaders. And there is a really awesome series that your institute has published called In Their Own Words. And definitely want to ask you about that, and then get your hot take on some other recurring themes that have surfaced on the podcast. So does all that sound okay to you?
Yeah, terrific. I think that'll hit all the highlights for sure.
All righty. So before we get into these topics, could we start by getting your assessment on our strategic landscape and how China in particular fits into the picture?
Well, I think over the last couple of years, certainly starting in the Trump administration and carrying through today, there's been a wide recognition of the challenge that we face with China going forward, right? So there's some good, some bad, some areas of cooperation, some areas of conflict. But before that, we were obviously more focused on the Middle East and, the anti-terrorism and the anti-extremism campaigns and things like that. So, but there's really been a change here. Whereas from China's perspective, it's just been a steady march in their development and what they see, and Xi Jinping talks about their return to their rightful place on the center of the world stage. And so I think this is just going back to, it's been a long time, a generation of leaders in the Marine Corps or throughout the DoD, right, that just haven't had to deal with a peer competitor with global ambitions. And so it's really, it's a new way of thinking. We have to go back and look at some of the old theories and doctrine, and then, try to find new ways to apply them to this very different situation, because it's not at all the same as it was with the Soviet Union. But, they say history doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly does rhyme.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite quotes as well. I think that gets attributed to Samuel Clemens, interestingly enough. So when you hear things like great power competition, what are the kinds of things that come to mind for you?
So I actually like this framing, unlike some of the other ones, because it talks that it is a competition, right? It's a competition of ideas. First and foremost, that's really what we're arguing over, and then the practical realities of how you apply those. And so it's economic, it's diplomatic, it's trade, and obviously there's a military factor and a national security factor as well. So I think it frames it because it's not conflict, and you can be in different forms of competition across each of those spectrums. And I think the fact that we talk about it being competition, it acknowledges that at this point, it's not bipolar; it's multipolar at this point. So I think I like that particular framing. Now, whether you call it strategic competition or there's a new phrase the Biden administration likes because it was great power competition, now it's strategic competition, right? Because you can't have anything in the previous administration. But I think that gets kind of at the heart of what we're looking at now, or in a geopolitical sense.
Right. Do you think you could take a moment and tell our audience a little bit about the China Aerospace Studies Institute?
Yeah, sure. What we do is, I tell people that the Marine Corps has the Marine Corps Times, the Gazette, the Navy's got Proceedings, the Air Force has Airspace Power Journal, and so we publish lots of information about our thoughts and ideas and our doctrine. Well, China has all these same kinds of publications, right? They have newspapers, they have journals, they have books, professional reading, and the first line of defense for them is that it's all in Chinese, it's all in Mandarin, right? And there's very few people that actually read or speak Mandarin, and then there's very few people that have probably sat down and read an entire cover to cover version of the Gazette or Proceedings. And that's what we do, right? So everyone at CASI speaks and reads Chinese. We sit there, we go through all of this information. We also use, it's the modern world. So there's video feeds, there's stuff on YouTube. There are social media accounts and things like that. And we read it and we synthesize it and try to bring it together in a meaningful way that contributes to our side of the competition. And so that's really, it's all open source, publicly available. That's the great part about my job. So I could talk to you about it. I could talk to our partners and allies and friends across the government. And we put it all up on the website in PDF. So anyone and everyone can get it. And the idea is just to get the most information to the most amount of people so they can make the best decisions with it.
We had a conversation before we hit record. You guys are one of two DoD China think tanks. What's the other one?
Yeah, so we like to call them our big brother, our dog in Chinese. So that's the China Maritime Studies Institute, so CMSI. They are actually part of the Naval War College, and they sit up at in Newport, Rhode Island. And they were actually the ones that did the groundbreaking work on the maritime militia, which is now, in the national conversation as part of the gray zone operations and things like that. But it really was them doing the same kind of work that, the NUG work that we do, going through local papers, going through local news broadcasts, and weaving all of these threads together to come up with a picture and just really explain how China is using their maritime militia in gray zone operations throughout the South China Sea and East China Sea. So, and really other than that, those are the only two, certainly in the publicly available sphere, the only two institutes that are in the DoD that are focused on China. Now, there's people here and there that do China, and obviously the intelligence community has a robust capability, but they're overworked and under resourced, and so we try to help out wherever we can in the publicly available information sphere.
We'll have links to all of this in the show notes. Okay, so you mentioned this, or you alluded to it, but you guys have a really interesting series called In Their Own Words. Could you describe this series? And then I wanted to ask you in particular about one that you've published related to information operations.
Sure. Well, and like I said, there's only a handful of people, although there's more and more today, certainly of the younger generation, which is fantastic to see. But there's only a handful of people that have been doing China for a long time and read or speak Chinese, and so that limits all of those who don't, read Chinese to having to read what we say the Chinese are saying, right? And so, which is fantastic, but there's not enough of us to go around to service everyone. So what we've tried to do it started with some high-level strategic documents, and now we're pushing through some newspapers and trying to get it down, more and more information out there. But it's really to try to just bring all of that source material and make it available. It started really for students and faculty at Air University, and then we wanted to open it up to the rest of rest of the DoD, rest of the U.S. government, and really the whole academic community, so that they're not relying on just a handful of Chinese speakers to read through some Chinese, to pick one article they think is interesting, and then analyze it. And so all the English speakers would just get to read what I thought about a particular article. Now they can go and read different parts of, science and military strategy or all these documents. And so that's really what we've tried to do with the In Their Own Words, just to make it available. And the thing that I remind people, the Chinese are good communists. And what I mean by that, one of the central tenets of communism is this overall structural planning, right? And this is why they issue 5-year plans. They're famous for these, and they really do take it seriously, right? So they will write what they think. They will map out their plan, and then every year they will give you an update on that plan. And 5 years from now, they'll tell you how they did on that plan. And the way to execute and accomplish those things is to make sure that everybody knows it, right? And so they actually have to publish it throughout their system, and they're very open with a lot of this information, right? And just that, just the fact that we don't have access to it, or the average English-speaking American working in DoD doesn't have access to it. So that's really why we started it, because it's really in their own words. This is what the Chinese are saying that China is doing, and we should pay attention to that.
I'm looking at the website of subjects that you have these types of products for. So there's China diplomacy, dialectics and grand strategy, nuclear related writings, artificial intelligence and ethics. What types of outlets are you guys translating for this in their own words series?
Yeah, so we tried to start at the top. So the Chinese, so the People's Liberation Army, which is the armed wing of the Communist Party, has two kind of top level academic institutions. One's called the Academy of Military Science, and one is their version of National Defense University, right? And so these are, anything that comes out of there is fairly authoritative, especially if it's written by a committee of people. And so that's where we started. And those are the big picture, big strategy doctrines, if you will. So the science of campaigns, the science of military strategy. And so we started with those, but then we've also started, like I said, to try to get down into some of the academic journals. And here shortly, come next year, we're going to dump a couple terabytes of data. Now, obviously, we're not hand translating all of those. We're working on a machine learning translation engine for us, and just trying to tweak the last little bits to make sure that the translations are good. But really try to take a broad view of what they're thinking doctrinally, structurally, organizationally, as well as on some of these more aerospace related topics, and get that information out there. So that's it's really, like I said, it started at the top, but it now covers a pretty broad waterfront.
One of the documents that you guys have available is called Lectures on Joint Campaign I/O, and it looks like this was released or translated and put out there maybe in the 2009 time frame. For our audience, this is a large document. It's like 400 pages, and Brendan, I told you this before we recorded. I'll say it for the audience too. I did not read the entire document, but it looks like it is a tremendous resource, especially for the information operations and the information professionals community. Could you hit some of the highlights that you think are contained within this document?
Sure, and this is one of the ones I really like, because it kind of just talks about the different ways that China perceives the information operations and information domain, right? And so this is one of the really good things, because some of them are just, here's our doctrine, here's our organization, which maybe it's at least familiar enough to the United States audience. But their lectures on the joint information operations campaigns really kind of set them aside. And what it talks about is how China sees information and the information domain as a domain of war. And it's not really the way we in the United States conceptualize it necessarily. And Xi Jinping will actually talk about how he thinks that the next fight, the modern battle, is going to be won at the outset in the information domain. And they take a very broad view of that. So it's the public domain, it's the public diplomacy, it's the military domain, and what we would call military diplomacy. And it's also, it includes obviously the ones and zeros, but they put psychological operations, they put electronic warfare, all of this falls under, for them, the information domain. So it's conceptualized differently. And they're absolutely, laying the groundwork, prepping the battlefield now for any future conflict. And so what it talks about is how do you do each of these little parts and pieces. And it's important to understand that there's the party aspects of the Communist Party aspect of it. There's the People's Republic of China governmental aspect of it, right? And then there's the People's Liberation Army aspect of it, and how all three of them work together in ways that, one, we don't, or two, we can't in the United States for legal reasons. And so it's just a different nature, a different challenge that we're facing.
China famously has the three warfares, right? I'm probably not going to get this right, but there's legal warfare, psychological warfare, economic warfare. Is that
public diplomacy? Yep.
Okay. So is all of that kind of baked into this document as well?
Yep, it is. It all kind of fuses together, right? And it talks about how do you use each part of that system, right? So the state, the governmental part of the system, the party part of the system, and the People's Liberation Army part of the system. How do you leverage each of them, and how do you make sure that there's consonance when they go out and conduct these operations? And so lawfare is absolutely part of that, right? So that's usually the governmental apparatus that's using that. There's the public diplomacy and each part of that. So there's a propaganda department within the party, and they mean that in the literal sense, to propagate their ideas, to propagate their message. And ensure there's a lot of propaganda from the propaganda department. But it all is fused together, and something that, because the PLA is part of the Chinese Communist Party, right? They serve a political purpose, and so in ways that the U.S. military just does not. The PLA is absolutely an active participant in some of these information operations that are both public as well as not as overt, but also not only will they target people on another side, they will also target the Chinese public. And it's all part of one big information domain that they see as a constant battlefield, always in flux.
Do you perceive that the Chinese culture, their long multi-thousand-year history, somehow informs their present-day outlook, or even informs the way that they perceive the information environment?
I would say certainly they like to draw on they'll tell you 5,000 years of Chinese history, right? And how it used to be the center of the world for art and learning and science, as well as military and government, right? And the Chinese Communist Party, because they control all the levels of power and they control the educational system, this is part of their messaging. Again, part of the information domain, their messaging to the Chinese people. So it absolutely affects the lens through which they look at history, and they look at the world, and their, like I said, their future role in it. They talk about the Century of Humiliation, and this basically started with the Opium Wars, that was launched with Britain, and then came at the hands of the West, including the United States and Japan. Let's not forget, their centuries-old enemy, Japan. And so when Mao Zedong in 1949 stood on the gate of Tiananmen Square and declared that the Chinese People's Republic of China was established, this was the time that the Chinese people like to say they stood up, and they've overcome that century of humiliation. In fact, the Chinese national anthem starts with "Qilai, Qilai," which is stand up. And so it's the idea that they've overcome this century where China was forcibly removed by the West from their center of the world stage, and this is Xi Jinping and the Communist Party is leading them back to that center, and that really has been one of his driving emphases.
As I mentioned, this document came out in the 2009 period of time, so presumably there has been some changes or some advancements or some things that have happened over the last. I have a policy never to do math in public.
I agree with you.
The last 12 or 13 years or so since this document came out, do you have any kind of a sense of what is not contained in this, in their own words, document that might be in a future edition?
So I'd say, the things that have changed are probably some of the tools that are available, right? But the overall strategy is still there, and you can see the grand outline. So certainly in 2009, social media wasn't what it is today. Some of the technology and the capabilities that we have weren't quite as the same as they were back in 2009. But I think the broad strategy is there, and the Chinese, and specifically the PLA, have had this goal of what they call informationization. It's kind of an awkward word in English, but it sounds much better in Chinese. And it's basically this three-step process to bring the People's Liberation Army into the modern world. And so in 1991, for the first Gulf War, it was a huge shock to the Chinese system, just how far advanced the United States was. So we were fighting at night, we were fighting through bad weather conditions, we were fighting with GPS and precision guided munitions and all this. And so it was a shock to the Chinese system. And they said, look how antiquated we are. And so they started this campaign of informationization. And the first part was you had to digitize all of their old equipment, right? And so you can't have, analog equipment talking to each other. So they had to digitize everything. The next step was networkization. And so that was, how do you take, now that you have things in a digital format, how do you network them all together? And so they've largely completed those first two steps. They're still working a little bit on the networkization. But what they've come to start to talk about recently is this idea of smartification or intelligentization, neither of which is easy to say in English. But that's the idea of, hey, how do you get machine learning and artificial intelligence and work at machine speeds? And so that's really been their three-step process. And that is all part of that information, because it's how do you collect the information, how do you process that information, how do you disseminate it to the pointy end of the spear.
Yeah, well, I remember a project that Google was pursuing, again, 12, 15 years ago, something like this, but they were looking to digitize like all of the books in the world, anything that's publicly available, or even maybe in like a dusty attic in Europe, like some small little museum in Europe, if they could get their hands on a book, that they were trying to digitize it. It sounds like China is pursuing a similar agenda.
Yeah, and I think it actually goes into just the overall communist view of the world, right? So they view it in a very scientific terms. They think that everything is knowable, and if you gather enough data and you write the right algorithm, that any problem that you face, be it military or otherwise, is knowable and solvable, and that the great arc of history is moving toward, in their view, communism. And so that's why it's called the science of strategy, the science of joint firepower campaigns, right? The science of information operations, because they think it's a science. And so it feeds very well into this, just the communist view of life in the world. And that's why they love big data, and that's why they love high power computing. And so they absolutely are, trying to bring all of that into the PLA and into their national security sphere.
Is that right? Wow, that is in stark contrast to a thinker, for example, an economist like F.A. Hayek, right, who takes an opposing viewpoint that it's impossible to centralize that kind of knowledge, or you can centralize the data, but extracting actionable management knowledge from that data is, well, I think Hayek would say that it's impossible, but the Chinese or the communist project says no, it's possible, and that's what we're going to do.
Yeah, they believe it's and again, that's why they love high power computing, right? So it didn't used to be possible because it was just too much information, right? The butterfly effect. But they think that at the end of the day, right? So probably not today, they're not there yet, but that's the goal, and they think it's an achievable goal at some point in the future. And it is. It's just very different from a Western outlook on things. 50 years from now, we'll see. Maybe they're closer to that or maybe we're closer to that. But at this point, that's definitely one of the driving forces and why they're trying to modernize, and they collect just tons and tons of information, even if they can't use it or even access it right now. They think that in the future that'll all become available to them.
A couple of follow-ups on this document, and I think that you've touched on this maybe just a little bit, but just so I can ask it specifically, how do you perceive the Chinese are synchronizing their efforts globally? I think of things like the Belt and Road Initiative, but you might have some other thoughts about global synchronization. And also, are they making any strides related to joint campaigning in the information environment?
Yeah, so that's definitely one of the things that they and the Chinese are not 10 feet tall, right? They don't have this. They're not the Borg. they certainly have a lot of infighting and problems and things like that. But when we talk in the United States about trying to get a whole of government effort, the China, just because their system is different, is able to do that a little bit more, I would say, seamlessly or than the United States is. So they can harmonize their economic efforts, like you said, the Belt and Road, right? Trade policies, economic policies. All of the banks in China are state owned, right? So you can have the banks do things that U.S. banks just simply wouldn't do, because and they actually talk about this thing called strategic interest. So they may make loans that are not commercially viable for the United States, but because we're not going to get a financial interest out of it. But China is willing to take the strategic interest. So they use that in the information domain, and they're also using obviously the goodwill and the connections and all those things that they're getting through this infrastructure project called the Belt and Road, and just their economic and their trade and diplomatic relationships, all fusing together. Because at the end of the day, what they want to make sure is that, like I said, the information domain is prepped and ready for them, so that God forbid we ever come into conflict. But if something happens in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, over Taiwan, that they have their narrative out there, and they have some degree of support from the international community to either condemn U.S. involvement because it's so far from the United States we couldn't possibly have any interest there, from their part of view, or at least are not active participants, right? And that's where it goes toward, especially Korea and Japan, the Philippines, right? And it's all part and parcel of just that information domain. And taking that, hey, this is a battlefield that we're competing today in, and we're not going to wait for conflict to erupt, because the time to establish that foundation is now, and that's exactly what they do through all of these levers. Again, it's not a perfect system, and there's lots. They have a lot of missteps. The Wolf Warrior diplomacy really kind of fell flat with the rest of the world, maybe for some good play within China, but they had a misread there. They obviously had a huge misread of the Australian psyche, and how the Australians would react. But they learn it's an iterative process, and they haven't been doing big picture global world stage operations for a long time. So one can expect that they will only get better as the coming decades approach.
Do you think we could transition to our next item on the agenda? Something that I've been wanting to bring into this forum, and this is just kind of like the start of this larger, longer conversation, but I'd be interested to know who some of the key thinkers are within China, and to help to start familiarizing our audience with some of the people who are influencing China today. And this could be like a military thinker, a political thinker, even like a cultural influencer. But I'll let you take that in whatever direction you think is productive.
Sure. Well, and I think, not to be glib, but I think in today's China, you really have to start with Xi Jinping, right? Because he is, unlike previous Chinese leader, or at least his previous two predecessors, he has really brought key decision making, key political and policy decisions into his own hands, right? And so you have to look at Xi Jinping as the general secretary of party and the chairman of the Central Military Commission, as the guy that's leading the way. And now they have Xi Jinping thought. They have Xi Jinping thought on a number of things, and this actually gets taught throughout the military, right? Again, it goes back to it's a political organ. They have political commissars, and actually 1/3 of the training that gets done in the PLA is political training, right? And so first you have to start with him, and then you can kind of start to make expanding circles from him. But he really has, he has a tradition of or a background with the PLA, and he served for a short period of time in the PLA in his younger days, and so he really does have a direct impact on some of these thinking. And because of that, he's also very forward thinking. And like I said, he understands the nature of the strategic environment that China faces, right? And sees how information in all of its forms, high power computing, quantum computing, and all those things really affects it. And so he really is on the leading edge of these things. So he's definitely not set in his ways, and he sees space and cyber as very important, right? And so he has leaned on some of the leaders in China who are focusing on some quantum computing or space technologies and things like that. And so it's really kind of unlike, like I said, under Hu Jintao, which was his immediate predecessor for 10 years, and Jiang Zemin before that. It's really people that are directly connected to the head of the party that have these kind of these information. So what CASI has done is a series of publications that kind of look at the aerospace industrial base and look at some of the science technology organizations and institutions to try to get at, who are these people that are influencing the way that he sees it, because he, at the end of the day, is driving the policy. And so those, like I said, they're up on the website, publicly available, and anyone's more than happy to take a look at some of those things.
Great. Well, can we transition to talent? So a recurring theme on this podcast and in a number of national security forums is we're in a war for talent, and not just talent within the U.S., but it's a global war for talent, and it's a war between national security organizations and commercial organizations. Talent's a big deal, but do you think that you could talk a little bit about China and its talent pool and talent management practices?
Sure. And the first thing I got to remind everyone is that when you talk numbers in China, they're all big, right? So 1.4 billion people in China. So even if there's only a small percentage of those who have advanced degrees and PhDs, that's still a really big number. And so China, over the last couple of decades, has put a lot of time and effort into growing its STEM field, growing its science and technology, especially the high technology and leading edge stuff. And what they call indigenous innovation, right? They're trying to spur this on so that they're no longer reliant on US technology or Western technology, and they're really trying to be able to do it themselves. So they've had a lot of time and effort, and an economy that's been clipping along. The last couple of years, it's been down in the single digits, COVID notwithstanding. I think 6.5% was the prediction for this year. But obviously before that, 20 plus years of double digit in GDP growth allows the government to do a lot with that, right? So they've attracted some talent, they've attracted some investment, they've built these mega, research enclaves. Basically, there's one in Beijing, there's one in Shanghai, there's several throughout the country where they bring high tech in, and then of course they try to get overseas talent, and they send the Chinese, scientists out into the world as well, right? So they're all around. They've gone to the United States, obviously, but also to Britain, into Europe, to study, to learn, to get these labs. And then for the Chinese diaspora who was living overseas, they've actually made a concerted effort to get them back to China, at least on a part-time basis. So, well, you may be a professor at Cambridge, but we'd like you to be able to set up a lab here in Beijing, right? And you can come over in the summer for a couple months and make one or two trips during the rest of the year. So you can have your day job at Cambridge, but please come back to China. And we'll let you run your own lab just so we can get some of that. And again, because it's just simply a different system in China, where the party controls everything and the state implements the policy decisions. They actually have a national level strategy called military civil fusion, which by both party regulation and by governmental law requires things in the what we would consider the private sphere or the public sphere to be able to be brought into the national security and the People's Liberation Army, right? So they just feeds it all into the system. So broadly speaking, that's what China is looking at on a talent pool. Part of their problem, though, is absolutely the same problem that we face: is how do you get those guys into the military? How do you get them to join the PLA? And that's been a serious problem for them.
Really? So, I mean, based off of what you were saying, the civil military fusion at the 100,000 foot level, everything looks relatively machine-like, but you're saying that when you get down to the tactical, individual level, things can get messy, even in a authoritarian system like China is putting together.
Yeah, military civil fusion is meant to bring technology and information back into the national security sphere, like I said, into the PLA if necessary, right? But at the bottom level, you can't. MCF is not for individuals, right? It's for big picture and for companies and things like that. But how do you get a guy that's gone through college, gone through probably grad school, to join the PLA? That's really the question. Or how do you get? So they've had a number of programs over the last probably decade and a half, trying to figure out how do you get more college graduates, both on the enlisted side or just people with college degree, not college degrees, but college experience, especially on the enlisted side, but also on the officer side. How do you get them to join the PLA? How do you get them to stay in the PLA? How do you get them promoted? And it's a challenge because, you know, as China's economy develops, there's lots of opportunities outside of the PLA. The PLA still, although they've, you know, doubled the salaries in a couple instances and improved the standing, the social standing, as well as the compensation. It's still not nearly the same as working in a lab, working at a university, working for a, you know, maybe a joint venture or something like that in China. So it's a challenge to get those guys to join the PLA, and then especially on the enlisted side to stay in the PLA. Because in the old days, you could take someone with a ninth grade education and give them an AK-47 and say, hey, the pointy end goes that way. It's not at all the same when you're dealing with quantum computers and satellites, you know, or flying a you know, a fourth or fifth generation aircraft, you know, off of an aircraft carrier. You need people that are well educated, that are smart, and that are driven to be able to come in and do some of these really high tech jobs that, like I said, Xi Jinping himself sees as the future of warfare. And so that's where the PLA has tried to emphasize. They had something similar to an ROTC program that just didn't seem to work out. They were never able to actually hit their quotas. They have the problem of getting people into on their enlisted side. And there's a whole host of things that I want to go down that rabbit hole, but certainly in a later, happy to talk about NCO development. But yeah, it's an issue for the PLA specifically, is how do you get them and how do you get them to stay?
Do you have any sense of how the PRC is professionalizing like information specific skills, either on the military side or otherwise, like you know, their space workforce or their electronic warfare, PSYOP, cyber workforce?
Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, we have to remember that the PLA is organized differently than the U.S. military, right? And so they actually have in 2015, 2016, Xi Jinping and the Central Military Commission completely reorganized the PLA. They made theater commands, which are loosely analogous to our combatant commands, and they stood up a couple new forces, one of which is the Strategic Support Force. And this is their space forces and their cyber forces melded together under a single force, a single commander. And again, for them, this is all part of the information domain. So electronic warfare, PSYOP, cyber, all of that stuff for them is part of information domain. And so the commander of the SSF really is the, you know, in American terms, you could say he's a combatant commander for the information domain. It's not exactly the same, but you know, loosely analogous, because they see all of those things as integrally linked. Because, and I tell people, right, except for the little piece of metal on top of the really big rocket, everything that happens to and from space goes through the EM or the cybersphere, right? And so all of the intel, all the imagery, all the commands to the satellites, everything that happens, you know, has to go through that. And so it's kind of like a kill chain, right? They see it as they call it system of systems, right? So if you could take out a system of this bigger system, you could accomplish your means. So I don't have to kill your satellite if I can destroy all your ground link systems. And I don't have to destroy your ground link systems if I can just corrupt the computers or the network that you're using for that information. So it's a system of systems. And so they put it all under the SSF to harmonize that, right? And to put one guy in charge of the information domain. And then for the workforce specifically, what they've done is they put out a bunch of hiring notices, and we actually have a publication that talks a little bit about the development of the SSF and who these people are, what talents they're looking for in what particular units, right? And so they're trying to draw specifically on those sides from the outside. They've created a system which is, although they wear uniforms, but they're not active. They're not active duty officers. They're more akin to what our government civilians are, to try to bring them in, just, you know, much like, you know, even the Marine Corps is talking about, hey, how do we get, you know, a cyber expert to join the military, because he's not probably going to want to go to boot camp, and maybe we bring him in as a gunnery sergeant pay and just be a cyber expert, right? So it's the same kinds of things, but they absolutely are leveraging public-private partner, what we would call public-private partnership. It's all, you know, it all falls under the state rubric from China. But with academic institutions, with universities and things like that, to get these highly advanced, very technical things into the SSF specifically, And of course, it applies to the PLA more broadly, but really under the Strategic Support Force. And they put a lot of time and effort, and there's a constant recruitment battle going on as they continue to develop and build out the SSF.
Wow. And you mentioned that CASI has a product on these types of.
Yeah, we've got a couple products, and one that's in the works. So you can check out the CASI website, or just send me an email. You can put the contact information in the show notes. And that's, again, that's the great part of my job, is it's all unclass, openly available, and we're happy to send it out to people if they're interested.
All right, we'll be sure to drop that in the show notes as well. All right, well, Brendan, you've been very generous with your time. I'd like to do a quick lightning round kind of a thing with you, if you don't mind. And so when someone talks about technological standards in China, what are the kinds of things that come to mind for you?
Yeah, that's one of the things I think the United States just did not have a great appreciation of, and China absolutely understood the international environment. You could call it as part of the lawfare. It's not exactly, but hey, they get into the ITU, right? They get into all these wonky international organizations that no one really pays attention to because they're just so mired in the details. But that's really where it matters, right? And so as we develop 5G, as we develop standards and technologies for future, the Internet of Things and all of these things, China wants to set them. They actually have a China Standards 2035 project, right? So they want to be in all of these standard setting organizations so that they can have a hand in it, and they can then tailor this programs back to A, Chinese companies, and B, the way China wants to be able to manipulate and use data, which needless to say is very different from how the Western democracies around the world, India, Japan, Australia, how we have a very different view of what that looks like.
And to our audience, we just published a episode recently with Elham Tabasi of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, so I'll refer you to that as well. Next, trust. There has been a lot of talk about trust, trust in data, trust in institutions. When you think about trust these days, what kinds of things come to mind for you?
Yeah, the trust in data, that's really the big question, right? So as you get deeper into, for example, deep fakes, how do you trust the information that's coming in from all these sensors? So as China expands and continues their informationization drive, that's fantastic for them. And you get more of these, all the shooters become sensors is a way that, the U.S. military likes to talk about it. But that also opens up a huge aperture and a lot more surface area for things to go wrong and for bad information to get in the system. So how do you trust those things? How do you ensure that the information you're getting is good? How do you make sure your algorithm is not corrupt? Interestingly enough, and I always find this amusing, but it gives you a window into the Chinese psyche. They actually have laws and regulations that any artificial intelligence that is developed in China must be politically reliable. So let that sink in for a second. That's certainly, I don't think Google or Microsoft is worried about political reliability when they're going through and trying to develop AI, but that's actually a requirement in China because that's how they see it, right? They see it as the party as the leading organization for all facets of life, and therefore, AI in the future has got to be reliable. So that's certainly something that they're thinking about, and as they turn over more and more decisions to computers to work at computer speed, they got to be able to trust it.
Right. And presumably some of these themes are touched on in their own words, item dealing with ethics and AI.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Tech acquisition. It's been a topic that has plagued America for many years, the speed of technological adoption. How can you put that into a China context?
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge for the United States on the acquisition side, right? So I think we've done a better job over the last probably decade. DIUX is a perfect example of going out to Silicon Valley, going to Boston, going to these high tech hubs and saying, hey, how can we work with you? How do we get the stuff into the U.S. System faster? Again, for China, it's a little bit different issue because their system is set up differently, and it's all part of one big system, right? And so anything that goes into the Chinese system at any level really has the potential to get fed back into their national security stats, right? So anything that goes to Huawei to ZTE, And the Chinese do a lot of perfectly legal investments and acquisitions around the world, right? And this is something that the United States has only come to grips with here recently. Something above 90% of technology transfer requests actually get approved by the U.S. government and sent to China. And so China is perfectly happy to come and buy companies, buy technologies, invest. It's not just here in the United States, but it's certainly in Europe, and it's in Australia, it's around the world, in India. And they're perfectly happy to be able to do that, and they have the cash to be able to do that, to bring that all back in. And so they just have a different, like I said, it's a different system. It certainly has some strengths, but it certainly has some weaknesses, and I wouldn't trade ours for theirs. But we need to be clear-eyed when we take a look at what China is doing and how they're doing it around the world, and how do we make sure that our commercial companies are competing on a fair and even ground, because when they do that, we absolutely will win every time. But we have to make sure that the environment is such that they're able to do that in a free, open way.
Great. Last lightning round question. Colonel John Boyd and the OODA loop have come up several times on the podcast, and it seems like Boyd and the OODA loop is having somewhat of a renaissance. Boyd was an Air Force officer. You're part of the Air University. Does John Boyd get talked about around the halls where you reside?
Yeah, so absolutely all around AU. In fact, down at Air University at Maxwell Aerospace, there is an OODA loop. So it's a short little road. It's the name of a road. Yep.
Okay. Yeah.
Which I always find very, very humorous. They're right in front of the schools at Air University. So, but yeah, it's absolutely on their minds. But it's also on the Chinese minds as well, right? And so they understand. They talk about how do you get inside the OODA loop, and that's one of the reasons that they are so interested in high power computing, machine learning, artificial intelligence, because they see that as the way to get inside of the American OODA loop. Right. And the challenge that China faces is very different from the challenge the United States faces. Right. They're at this point very localized. Right. All of their major concerns are, Taiwan, the East China Sea and the South China Sea, all very close to China. They'll have interior lines. They'll have some sort of sanctuary. And so that the challenge that they're facing is different than the challenge that we're facing. And so they talk about the OODA loop, and they talk about how do you shrink theirs, how do you get inside, and how do you turn over things to machine speed so that they're doing things faster. It also explains where they want to go with drone warfare and swarming, right? How do you overwhelm your opponent, right, to expand your OODA loop? So now instead of one missile or two missiles coming at an aircraft carrier or a destroyer, now you have 40 potentially armed UAVs. And how, which one do you shoot first? Do you shoot those because maybe there's a missile behind them? Right. And that's a way to expand that OODA loop and slow us down. And so they absolutely are thinking about that. And they apply that to the terrestrial sphere. They apply that to space, and they actually try to apply it in the information domain as well. So it's really something that they understand and are trying to apply.
Last question. If you could impart one or two takeaway or bottom line type items to a very senior leader, the President of the United States, the Secretary of State, some other world leader, what are the couple of things you would want this person to know about China?
Well, the first thing I always like to remind people is that it's not all Washington, Beijing, right? It's not all U.S. and China. China has a lot of other concerns. They got 1.4 billion people, and they face a huge amount of problems. So they're not 10 feet tall, and they're not coming to steal your children in the middle of the night at this point. But they do have a plan to get back to the center of the world stage. And they published that plan. They're marching toward that plan. And it should be no surprise when 5 years from now, they've largely accomplished the stuff that they've just said that they've set out to do. But along part and parcel with that is that we have something in spades that China has almost none of, and that's partners and allies, right? So we can't compete in the modern world without our allies and partners. They are absolutely critical to us, but they also make us stronger. And anything that we could do to make them stronger, even if it's no direct benefit to the United States, is absolutely in our national interest, right? So Australia, Japan, Korea, the Philippines, India, countries in Southeast Asia, Britain, now coming around, doing joint patrols with us in the South China Sea is a fantastic move. France will tell you, hey, they're a Pacific nation as well. And so it's really, how do we strengthen those partnerships? Because really, China has a very interesting, complex relationships with the DPRK on the peninsula, and they have a client state in Pakistan as far as military technology and hardware go, but they're not really allies. and that's really all that China has. And so we need to make sure that we are making the international system strong, and we do that by using and leveraging our allies and partners. And the part of that is going to them and asking them before we make decisions about programs or policies, and certainly, weapon systems and things like that, right? And we have to make sure that we understand their view of the world and what exactly their needs are, and not necessarily only through the lens of ours. So those are the two big things. The other one is that, it doesn't need to all be conflict with China. There are some beneficial parts of the competition. There are still plenty of areas of cooperation. And as we've seen with the pandemic and all the other, international and global issues, there's things that we're just not going to be able to get done if we don't have all the nations of the world, especially China and, India. India is going to surpass China in the total population, in the coming years. And so we need to make sure that they're all and it's, again, going back to what I kind of led off with, it's the competition of ideas, and the information domain is all about that. And so I think we have better ideas, and we just need to get that out to the rest of the world, and eventually I think that'll be in international interest. So
all right, Dr. Brendan Mulvaney, thank you so much for being on the Cognitive Crucible.
Great, thanks for having me. Look forward to it in the future.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.